Life in the Trinity Ministry, in partnership with Brian McLaren, is pleased to present this series entitled The Storyline of the Bible.
When I got up this morning, I turned on the television, as I often do, to catch the news. I really shouldn't do it. A lot of times it's so depressing. There are probably way better ways to start the day. Today on the news, though, there was entertainment news that caught everyone's attention. You probably saw this too. I won't mention any names, but a famous actor and movie producer was arrested for driving under the influence. And this was noteworthy because, of course, he's so famous, and also because one of the films he produced was about Jesus. And to find someone that drunk would be news. And then, to make matters worse, he made some anti-Semitic comments that obviously just made the whole situation from a tragedy into a disaster for this man personally. They were showing his mugshot all over the media today, and as I saw him with that kind of pathetic drunk smile, looking way too happy to be arrested, just showing how completely out of it he was, I thought to myself, that's me, and that's all of us. We human beings are an enigma to ourselves. We do such stupid things. We're capable of so much, and yet we do some things that are so phenomenally stupid. And we just can't come to terms with ourselves. How can you make a film about Jesus and make anti-Semitic comments? How can you be such a successful producer and make such a fool out of yourself getting drunk? But that's all of us. And so today I'd like us in this podcast to think about ourselves and human beings in general. We're going through the biblical story in this podcast. We're looking at it in 7 episodes, from creation, crisis, calling, and so on. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time in creation because it's in going back to our origins, going back to our own Genesis, that we learn so much about ourselves and are able to make sense to some degree of this enigma that we as individuals and as a human species are. And we're down working our way through the story of creation. And we had gotten as far as God saying, "Let there be light," and God creates over the course of the next several days sky, land, vegetation, stars, sun, moon, aquatic life, bird life, and then when we come to the 6th day, that's when we human beings show up. We're latecomers in the creative story, and that's what the scientists tell us. And that's also what the scriptures tell us. Unless we think too highly of ourselves in the scriptural story, we don't even get a day to ourselves to be created. We're just part of the creation of land-based life. The story goes like this in Genesis 1, starting in verse 24. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. I just need to pause and say, I just love this, that in this primal understanding of God as creator, God creates the domesticated animals, cows, sheep, and so on. But God also is the maker of the wild animals, and I just love this picture to remind ourselves that, we often think of God in relation to very staid buildings and very structured institutions, but in the book of Genesis, God is the God of light and the God of sky and the God of the seas and whales and fish, and He's the God of the wild animals, the things that are not and cannot be domesticated by us human beings. Well, it's in that context that God then says, "Let us make human beings in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." Here we have this picture of we human beings being created then on the 6th day, which is Friday. And now I know when they make automobiles, they say that the worst cars get made on Friday because everybody's getting ready for their weekend. But we human beings are made on this on Friday, along with these other mammals. And we're given a special identity. First, God says, let us make human beings in our image, in our likeness. Now that "our" is evocative. Some people would immediately think, oh, this is referring to the Trinity. Obviously, the original hearers never would have thought that, but maybe there's some resonance there. Probably most scholars would say that this is the royal we, God as the kingly we. And that certainly is possible too. Other scholars might say, well, this is evocative of the idea that many other nations believed in many gods, but the Jews have brought the many into one, that one God is the creator of all humanity. And this phrase, image of God, let us make man according to our image, according to our likeness, that's very, very rich phrase, the imago Dei. It probably means a lot of things. Some people would say, well, it means intelligence, or it means self-awareness or self-consciousness. It might involve memory and mind, all those kinds of things. But I think in particular what the text itself suggests is that our image is a reflection of God's kingly image, because God says, let us make human beings in our image and our likeness so that they may rule over the fish of the sea. God is the king over all creation, and creation is seen as God's territory, God's kingdom, and we human beings are meant to share with God kingship over the earth, rulership over the earth. Now, we have to say immediately that these words, rule and dominion and related words, have been so horribly abused in the modern era. Industrial man, in the industrial age, took these verses and grossly distorted them as if they were a carte blanche to destroy and pillage and plunder and rape the environment, to just do whatever we wanted to do for our own wealth and our own profit and our own advancement of our personal interests and our corporate interests and our national interests. That is so far from what these verses mean. It's just disgusting and nauseating and pathetic that these words were used in that way. Let's try to really understand what is meant by this idea of us being made in God's image, in a way, in God's kingly image, to exercise rule. Now, remember, in the beginning of the story, God doesn't control everything. God hovers over the waters. God evokes. God interacts. But it's not. It might be dominion in the sense of kingship, but it's not domination in the sense of control and despotism. So God is the kind of king who gives space for things and gives room for things to develop. God works with a process. And in that sense, God is inviting us to work with creation. We aren't just servants of creation, and we aren't dominated by creation, but we're involved in the ongoing evoking of creation's full possibilities. We're supposed to join God, to be with God in God's image, in seeing the best and the most come out of creation. Now that, to me, is a very, very different role from the kind of role that modern industrial era humanity carved out from these verses. There's a sense in this kind of rule that involves caretaking and service and stewardship. But it's this role of evoking and developing. I don't know if you're driving on your way to work, if you're listening to this in your iPod or sitting at a desk maybe on your lunch break listening to these words. But I wonder if you can think about your work, what you're doing today, as part of participating with God in the bringing out new possibilities of creation. I mean, it's easy to imagine how a farmer or gardener does this. But in a sense, all of our work ultimately works with creation. The electricity you're using to listen to this broadcast, it would be nice if it had been generated by wind energy or some other renewable energy source. But probably just listening to this broadcast, we're all making use of fossil fuels, which is probably going to turn out to be one of our bigger mistakes and abuses of creation, unless we find some ways to shift over from non-renewable to renewable energy. But to be involved in this work, whatever our work is participating in God's ongoing creation. You could think about it like this. God doesn't make the world fully populated, but rather God gives room for all the species to reproduce, to make more of their own kind. And in that way, when God creates us and invites us as image bearers of God to join in God's work in creation, he's saying there's a lot of work left to be done. And that's what you and I are doing. I'm, in a certain sense, participating, hopefully, in this podcast with God's creative work in the world. And I hope you can see whatever it is that you do in the same light as well. And so our job is to interact with creation. And that in and of itself is a significant problem for us, because we create these boxes and bubbles and all these ways of separating ourselves from creation. But ultimately, everything we do is interacting with creation, with material God made, with energy God made, with time and space that God made. And so our lives need to be interacting with God's creation in ways that would reflect God's image. So if we abuse, we're being a bad image of God. We're misrepresenting God. If we're wasteful, if we're careless, if we're too fast, we don't want to pay attention to the process, the seasons that have to evolve in their own time. If we want to rush things too fast, we're being a bad image bearer of God. And so the story continues. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. Now this reminds us that men and women together bear the image of God, not men alone, not women alone. And this is very important, especially because in the translation I just read, so God created human beings in his own image. We have all kinds of struggles about gender, not only in our own relationships, but then we wonder about God and gender. And because in English we tend to use male, masculine pronouns and imagery to talk about God predominantly, we live in a great danger of thinking of God as a male deity. But here in the beginning of the Bible, no, God is not a male deity. God expresses God's self in maleness and femaleness. Both reflect the image of God. And with all of the chauvinism and terrible abuse of women that's happened through the centuries, we have to be very, very careful to remind ourselves and one another that no, the feminine reflects the image of God every bit as much as the masculine. And in fact, a masculine characterization of God is incomplete. It's a misrepresentation without the feminine. So all of the men who are listening, we have to ask ourselves, to be true image bearers of God, are we welcoming the expression of the feminine in our lives, in our families, in our churches, in our businesses, in our government? Are we treating every woman that we meet as an equal image bearer of God? And women, this is important because there is so much mistreatment of women in our world. You have to remember that from these very first verses of the very first chapter of the first book of the Bible, you are given equal dignity as an image bearer of God. God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. In verse 28, it continues, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Now again, these are exactly the kind of verses that were grossly abused in the industrial era, where subduing was seen and ruling were seen in the most horrible ways, not ways that God wants to care for the world. These were obviously abuses of these scriptures. Be fruitful, he says. Increase in number. There's the sense that our reproduction is also an expression of God. Because God is, can we say it this way? God is a fertile or productive God. God makes the whole universe, and God invites us to participate in creation through parenthood. All of us who are parents, maybe as we read these words, we can realize that this is part of our identity, part of our expressiveness of God's image, even in reproduction, in the bearing and raising of children. I also think for those of us who aren't parents yet, or maybe never will be, we see here that creativity and productivity is essential to who we are. Now, some of us, we do that through art. Others, we do through service. When you cook someone a meal, you're creating a unique eating experience for a unique group of people on a unique day. It's a profound work of fruitfulness and productivity. And when we all show kindness to children, we're taking part in the raising of a new generation. I don't know if you've thought about this lately, but every child that you pass is a sacred creation in the image of God. And every opportunity you have to play with a child, to be kind to a child, to teach a child, to just be a good example for a child, just to give a child a smile, that's holy work. It's being part of this creation privilege and honor we've been given to be image bearers of God. By the way, later in the Bible, there is so much to show that to rule over is not in any way a carte blanche for manipulation or oppression. The Jewish people were told in the Torah that they have to make sure that their animals got a rest. They couldn't exploit their animals. And in fact, to mistreat animals was to disobey God. So whatever rule and subdue mean, they don't mean this harsh domination. They mean interaction in a godlike way. And interestingly, along with a certain dignity as image bearers of God, that dignity also bears responsibility and limits. Listen to how the next verses say it, starting in verse 29. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move on the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. Now, I think the imagery here suggests that the writers, that the poet and poets behind these words, they don't want to give us the feeling of tearing apart meat and all the rest. It's a vegetarian image. Someone gave me a beautiful poster. It's from targetearth.org that hangs just across from me in my office here, and it says God's original plan was to hang out in a garden with some naked vegetarians. Well, the picture here is that we're given food to enjoy, and we're given bounty. And whether or not you're a vegetarian, I think there's just the sense that whenever we eat, we should see the act of eating as an enormous privilege, as gifts from God being given to us. You know, the Native Americans, the stories are told that whenever they would shoot, for example, a deer in the forest, they would kneel down next to the body of the deer, and they would thank the Great Spirit for giving them the deer. And they would thank the deer for giving itself to them as food. And there's this sense of givenness in our eating, that we eat with this gratitude. You know, one of the great things that my dad and mom taught me is they taught me the habit of giving thanks before I eat. Now, I know some people think that that's just a sort of a meaningless ritual, but to me, it's a very meaningful thing. It's a reminder that everything I eat ultimately comes from God's world, from God's soil. It didn't come shrink-wrapped in plastic in a grocery store, but there was a farmer who planted the seeds and tended the plants. And if I'm eating meat that also had to eat animals. That also had to eat ultimately plants. And ultimately everything that we are in our bodies comes from the soil and the water and the air, through the miracle of photosynthesis in plants. We are so connected to to green plants and everything that we do. All of our energy ultimately is solar energy that was transformed through plants into a form that now we can use and we can live. It's a wonderful dependency where all of the higher things, the animals, are dependent on a lower thing, the plants. And we're ultimately beautifully connected. Everything that has the breath of life in it depends on those green plants. So at the end of the sixth day, we read, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. So, today, I imagine you're going to eat. And I imagine you're going to see members of the opposite sex. And I imagine you're going to have work to do. And maybe you can help now see the meaning of what you do as flowing from what happened in this beautiful story of the sixth day. This is Brian McLaren for Wired Parish.
You've been listening to Brian McLaren. You can visit Brian online at wiredparish.com.